Hello, this is James Mitchell, and we are back with another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have, Trump calls for arrest of seditious Democrats who told troops their duty is to uphold the Constitution, from independent.co.uk, posted by Swan Yankee Dan, and that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Trump when he uses rhetoric like that, but Reddit's, whenever the in-group uses rhetoric like that, Reddit will just sweep it over the rug. Former governor of Massachusetts and Libertarian Party vice presidential candidate William Weld, who's technically a Republican now, I think, but, he's never really been a Democrat. But, he's much more in-group now, I would say. He said, Trump's guilty of treason, and the penalty for treason is death, and Reddit doesn't remember that one at all. But if Trump says the same thing, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. It just goes to show you, it doesn't really matter what people say anymore. It matters who says it and how the news cycle reports on it. Reddit is the front page of Reddit is going to be biased to whatever the official DNC narrative is. Pretty much any Democrat can wish death on Trump, and it will fly under the radar. But Trump says the same thing, and it's the worst thing ever. It just goes to show you that people don't really have any standards, only teams, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have, you're no longer an ICE agent, you're now a Homeland Defender, posted by Cowdog Curmudgeon, and that looks like a screenshot from usajobs.gov, Homeland Defender, Immigration Services Officer, and that looks like the job offer for, I guess that's what they're calling the position now, I guess. Ultimately, the U.S. government can label any position, whatever it wants to, but, personally, I don't really care for anyone who's just doing it was just an errand boy for the U.S. government. That's pretty much what ICE is. If you want to join ICE, just by doing whatever you want to. But I personally don't think it's good. You should just be doing the government's legwork for them. You need to resist the government, regardless of which branch of the Uniparty is in power. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, is the Washington Post becoming libertarian, from Reason.com, posted by Lemon Limelight, and they said, the Washington Post opinion editor Adam O'Neill outlines his vision for a more classically liberal editorial voice, examines how both parties turned against free speech and free markets, and explains why the paper is ending political endorsements. And yeah, I personally don't care for the Washington Post. They might be marketing themselves as more libertarian, but they're just gonna be not. They're I think they're too far gone at this point. They're just a shit lib DNC rag, regardless of how they're gonna market themselves. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for them. Reddit loves them, of course, because they always tell them what they want to hear. But, it's interesting how Reddit exclusively pretty much believes whatever the Washington Post says. But, they're owned by a billionaire, Jeff Bezos, who they despise. And it just goes to show you, Reddit will just default to whatever the media sources that would say whatever they want to say, regardless of who owns them. Now that the Washington Post might be seen as more libertarian or right-wing, though, maybe they'll start questioning it more. But I doubt it. Reddit will just go rely on whatever sources that they feel like. There's the... I said this in a previous comment, but they have the two categories pretty much. The old legacy media sources like the TV and newspapers that have been around forever, like NBC, New York Times, Washington Post, and you got the new media sources, which are online versions of which came out more recently, but relatively the same circle jerk. Like Salon or Jacobin. Ultimately, Reddit will just rely on whatever sources that will support their narratives, and it's just important to remember that, regardless of how historic or prevalent a source is, that doesn't mean they're entitled to your trust. The New York Times and InfoWars are entitled to the exact same amount of trust from the public, and that's zero. Same with every other media outlet, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have Senator Chris Murphy sounds the alarm as Trump calls for the deaths of Dems who served the country to be killed for reminding the military their loyalty to the Constitution, not to him, posted by Donald Key, and that's crosspost from the FOMOS subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Trump's rhetoric here, but I'm sure if Joe Biden said the same thing, Reddit would think it's the greatest thing ever. But suddenly, the Democrats care about the Constitution, even though, they've pretty much been trying to get around it for as long as I can remember, especially the Second Amendment. but increasingly also the First Amendment as well. But yeah, when they take power, suddenly they'll be the ones saying, "Oh, your loyalty should be the president, not the Constitution." But right now, since Trump's in office, suddenly when he says that's the worst thing ever, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have U.S. Coast Guard will no longer classify swastikas, nooses as hate symbols from WashingtonPost.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's a crosspost from the Capital Consequences subreddit, which looks like it's since been removed by the moderators of that subreddit. But yeah, personally, I personally think the position for the U.S. government should be if you want to hire whoever you want to hire, I think that's fine. If they have tattoos of swastikas or nooses, ultimately that you want to hire them, that's fine. You should be able to hire or not hire anyone for whatever reason you think of. And yeah, that does include government hiring jobs as well. Personally, I do think the libertarian positions we wouldn't have any government jobs in the first place because we'd have that small government that pretty much all the jobs would be either elected or appointed. But right now, I would say that as long as whoever wants to, they should set whatever standards they want to, same with any other employer. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have a brief lesson in military law posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's crosspost from the Murdered by Words subreddit. And that looks like a picture of Lindsey Graham saying, "I don't think I've ever been on a show more unnerving than tonight. You've got U.S. senators, members of the U.S. House, suggesting there are men and women in the military that should be disobeying unlawful orders issued by President Trump and his military." And then it cuts to a screenshot of a tweet from looks like Melanie Dorijo, who said, "Members of the military are required to disobey unlawful orders. If you're upset when members of the military won't break the law, your military is being used unlawfully." And yeah, personally, ultimately, people are going to justify regardless of what the law says. Laws are really just suggestions when it comes to it. The government's going to justify whatever they're going to justify regardless of what's written down as a law. And it's very much, a lot of people go on about how important laws are, but, laws are just words on a piece of paper. What matters is how they're enforced. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have This Is Literally What Fascists Do, posted by CH4Locks, and that's a crosspost from the White People Twitter subreddit. And that's looks like a tweet from Brian Allen, who tweeted, "Breaking: the Chicago woman shot 5 times by Trump's border patrol and then charged as a terrorist. Just said all charges dropped. Agents claimed she pulled a gun and rammed them. The video showed they hit her first and her gun never left the holster. The state manufactured a threat, shot an innocent woman, and lied about it." And of course, Reddit's gonna ultimately align with whatever narratives of who's in the in-group, who's in the out-group. If this woman was MAGA patriot who was doing the exact same thing, and the video showed the exact same thing, Reddit would still justify the actions of the law enforcement. But since this is a member of the in-group that was getting attacked rather than a member of the out-group, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever, just like of everything else. And that just goes to show you, it doesn't really matter who does what people do anymore. It matters who does what. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Judge concludes prosecutors can circumvent federal grand juries in D.C. from NYTimes.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, "The ruling by a federal judge found that federal prosecutors could fall back on local grand juries to prove serious change charges when they failed to persuade a federal grand jury." And ultimately, the government, the legal system can justify doing whatever it wants to, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. That's very much why I think we should have a decentralized legal system rather than a centralized legal system, pretty much everything else. If people want to have to run their own courts and trials, that would be fine. Ultimately, it just comes down to who has the force to justify doing what. And right now, the government, since it runs the legal system, they can pretty much justify doing whatever they want to. And the peasants like me, we can't really do too much about it, and other than cry online, I guess, just like for a lot of other things. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have ICE says critical evidence in a peace case was lost and system crashed a day after it was sued, from 404media.co, posted by Ninja Lover, and that's crosspost from the technology subreddit. And yeah, personally, ultimately the government can justify losing whatever it can, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. And Yeah, personally, I would have liked them to have the critical evidence, if it was so important, more backed up on their hard drives or something. But sadly, sometimes, the government is as fallible as anyone else in that regard. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the state created a problem, shot an innocent woman and lied about it. Judge threw out the case, posted by Baton 13, and that's a cross post from the narco-capitalism subreddit, and that looks like the same tweet that we did from Brian Allen earlier under a few posts ago under This Is Literally What Fascists Do. And yeah, personally, of course, Reddit is going to think that, as I said earlier, this was a member of the out group doing the exact same thing. Reddit would think the law enforcement would be entirely justified, but since it's a member of the in group, Reddit thinks it's a tragedy. And as I said, it doesn't really matter what people do anymore. It matters who does what, and whether they're in group or out group. Next, we have White House crafting executive order to thwart state AI laws from CNBC.com, posted by Ragnarok KXG, and that's crosspost from the Anything Goes News subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think, if the White House wants to get around state AI laws, ultimately a lot of people are going to defer to what the White House says. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for AI laws, regardless of what level of government they're at. Ultimately, I think AI laws are a lot like gun laws. Ultimately, a gun is a tool that can be misused. Same with AI. But ultimately, people feel justified doing whatever they want with it, and the state shouldn't be telling what they can and can't do with it. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have He is Following Orders. Mike Johnson warns release of Epstein files could compromise national security from WeGotThisCovered.com, posted by Ragnarok KXG, and that's another crosspost from the Anything Goes News subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the Epstein file. I mean, I do care for the Epstein files, but I think at this point, they've been so built up, they can only really be underwhelming. Eventually, people will just move on to whatever the next thing is. It's a lot like how people used to be on January 6th or the Mueller report or whatever other things have been going on, the things that they thought could bring down Trump. But, eventually, but Trump, he's shown time and time again that he'll just dust it off and then continue on. And, the downfall of Donald Trump is something that I'll believe when I see at this point, I remember, it's been, people have been saying it for 10 years at this point. 10 years ago, I think it was when he was mocking the disabled reporter, and people say, oh, that's going to be his downfall. But, eventually, you're going to just when it's like, when you cry wolf so many times, in regards to Donald Trump's this is gonna be his downfall any day now. Eventually, people are just gonna stop paying attention, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Republicans shrug in response to Trump's suggestion Dems be put to death from RollingStone.com, posted by Donald Key. And I think we've already talked about this enough. And if Trump wants to say Democrats should be put to death, ultimately he should be able to say whatever he wants to. But Reddit doesn't care when the ungroup says it. Jay Jones, the successful Virginia Democrat nominee, had some edgy texts about putting the Republicans to death, and Reddit didn't care. They swept that under the rug, and they celebrated Charlie Kirk's death. Like the top comment here, just make fun about Kirk getting a boo-boo. They will have opinions. Ultimately, Reddit constantly wishes death on the outgroup, but when the outgroup wishes death back, suddenly it's the worst thing ever. And it just goes to show you these people have no values other than my side good, your side bad. Next, we have conservative think tank should never have crawled into bed with Tucker Carlson in the first place. I think the whole organization could collapse, said one senior staffer from Reason.com, and that's a cross post by Ninja Lover, and that's a cross post from the We the Fifth subreddit. And yeah, personally, I Tucker Carlson is someone I disagree with economically. He's much more of a socialist, arguably a national socialist, kind of like that Nick Fuentes, or a Nazi, I guess you could say. And I personally don't really agree with the Nazis and how they control. They're all about the state control of the economy. But, I definitely do agree with Carlson on a lot of other issues. And ultimately, if conservative think tanks wanted to climb into bed with him, I think they should have been able to. But now that they want to regret that, I think they should be able to as well, I guess. Ultimately, people are just going to justify whatever they want to justify, and sometimes may regret it later. And that's very much what life is all about. Sometimes you make a decision that you'll regret later, and that's, at the very least, you made a decision in the first place. So everyone's got regrets. Just because you regret something doesn't mean that you shouldn't have been free to make the decision in the first place. Next, we have a fraudster pardoned by Trump gets 47 years for running a Ponzi scheme from NewYorkTimes.com, posted by Ninja Lover, and they added, a New Jersey man convicted of defrauding investors roughly $250 million is driven among a growing number of people granted clemency, only being charged with new crimes. And yeah, personally, I think the libertarian position is, ultimately, if people want to defraud others, I think that's kind of scummy, but I don't think it should be illegal. I think, ultimately people are going to justify what they're going to justify as long as they're not physically hurting anyone else. I don't think the government should be taking sides. Maybe the investors should have done more research before signing up for this New Jersey man's Ponzi scheme. But, ultimately, that's why, I think you gotta always do more research before signing up for anything, because ultimately people are gonna lie and work in their own self-interest, and that's always important to remember as well. Also, I think it's funny that, someone like this guy can get 37 years for running a Ponzi scheme, but the U.S. government can run a Ponzi scheme in Social Security for almost a century, and no one even cares. In fact, that they think it getting taken out would be the worst thing ever. And it just goes to show you that, if the state does something, it's completely fine. But when an individual does, it's pretty much the exact same thing. It's the worst thing ever. And that's something else that, have to remember when it comes to politics. The state can justify pretty much whatever it feels like, and it will be, people will shrug and move on. But if the individual does the same thing, it's the worst thing ever. It's pirates and emperors. If I bombed the Middle East for decades on end without relenting, I'd be an international war criminal. But the U.S. government can do it, and it's pretty much just a Tuesday. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump offers praise for rational Mamdani, a remarkable White House meeting from thehill.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan, and that's crosspost from the Moderate Politics subreddit. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for Mamdani, just like I don't really care for Trump. And it just goes to show you, Trump is going to sell out to whoever is showing up and shaking his hand and rubbing him and sucking his cock enough, even if it's someone who he disparaged constantly like Mamdani. It just goes to show you that, Trump is just a puppet of the regime like the rest of them. As George Carlin said, big club, you ain't in it. And it's interesting, Marjorie Taylor Greene was on his side for forever, and now she's in the out group, and now he seems to be putting Mamdani more in the in group than him. And it just goes to show you that, ultimately it's all just political theater. Reddit will maybe Reddit will turn on Mamdani now, since their only consistent value is Orange Man bad. But ultimately, I don't think too much will change. Reddit will still think Orange Man the worst thing ever, and they'll say Mamdani, well, he was just visiting the president. That's okay. Next we have, but they'll complain about not getting the things on the left, posted by FastyRubeness739, and that's crosspost from the Narco-Capitalism subreddit. And the things on the left are reduced taxes, reduced government, more personal responsibility, liberty, less government control, and that there's an X down below all that. And then on the right side, there's expand deportation efforts, and there's a check mark. And yeah, it just goes to show you that, regardless of which branch of the party is in power, the government's only going to grow regardless of which of them is. And the Republicans might market themselves small government, but they'll grow the government at pretty much the same speed and as the other branch of the Uniparty and the Democrats. And just go to show you that, whoever you vote for, you pretty much always get John McCain, a guy who's pretty much going to do whatever the establishment wants, despite how he markets himself as otherwise. You got that with Obama, who said, "Oh, we're gonna get change," and he ended up being pretty much more the same. Then you got with Trump, and he said, "Oh, we're gonna shake things up," and he ended up pretty much being more the same too, despite how Reddit, social media, and the legacy media marked him as being otherwise. Next, we have GOP Rep. Marjorie Taylor Greene announces he is resigning from House from WashingtonPost.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, personally, I think that she was probably, I disagree with her on a few issues, but she definitely had become one of the better Congress representatives by the end of her tenure, and I'm sad that she's going. But ultimately, I think, I don't know why she's doing it. Maybe it's because it's the Epstein and Israel stuff. Just going to show you, if you step out of line from the Israel narrative, they'll force you out of any position of influence. And this is a good example of that. Look at Thomas Massey. He was critical of Israel, and then his wife just mysteriously dropped dead. It just goes to show you that who's really running the show here. It's the special interest groups, especially Israel. Then we have Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene says she will resign after follow-up with Trump from CNBC.com, posted by Ragnar OKXG. and that's a cross post, and that's a it's not a cross post, sorry. And yeah, personally, I do wish she would stay, but ultimately she wants to justify resigning. That's fine. I really wonder what's forcing her to resign now. I wouldn't be surprised if Mossad, the Israeli CIA, is threatening to take her out if she doesn't. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump's border chief framed protesters for violence, and then the body cam footage came out from Slate.com, posted by Swamp Yankee Dan. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for the violence of the state, but I'm sure if it was members of the outgrouping being the target of federal of law enforcement violence, Reddit would still justify law enforcement violence, but since it's the in group, Reddit thinks it's the worst thing ever, as they said of the couple of the previous posts. And then we have another post. Two socialists walk into the White House was by Lemon Limelight, and they said from a Washington Post editorial, emphasis added, what are a few deportation threats among friends? President Donald Trump has called Zoran Mamdani 100% competent obviously lunatic who needs to be deported. Mamdani called the president a despot, promising to Trump-proof New York, yet they couldn't have been chummier in the Oval Office meeting on Friday. What's happening here? In reality, Mamdani and Trump have some shared interests, and it's not just about building more apartments and tackling inflation. Both men are looking to seize more executive power, deepen the reach of the state into people's everyday lives, from government to bear on businesses and to entrepreneurs who won't fall in line. Mamdani knew he had much to lose walking into the Oval Office, including $7.4 billion of federal funding, and the Big Apple relies on to keep some services running. That's why the mayor-elect astutely focused on their shared affinity for state capitalism and protectionist rackets. Trump said that we have to go to the economists and start lowering their rates. Mamdani nodded. The blurring of the public and private sectors reflected Trump's treatment of Intel, which handed over a 10% stake to the federal government, and earlier musings from Vice President J.D. Vance, who claimed for in 2023 there is no meaningful distinction between the public and private sector in the American regime. For Mamdani, what's not to like about the state exerting more control over the means of production. And yeah, it just goes to show you that, pretty much Trump and Vance and that are just pretty much Democrats at this point. They'll justify expanding the state as much as possible, just like the Democrats will. The only difference is, maybe they aren't saying the right things about LGBTQ, whatever other layers they've added as well, people 24/7, and it just goes to show you, they're really just two sides of the same coin. As George Carlin famously said, it's a big club and you ain't in it. And then I have another post I wanted to share. It was a post I made to the Libertarian Party USA subreddit. I said, what would you say are the benefits of being a third party compared to a major party? And I said, people tend to focus on the negative rather than the positive, especially on social media. But let's take a look from the bright side. Here's what I managed to come up with. Smaller, easier to make your voice heard in a network of other party members. Don't have to worry as much about selling out your principles and regards for electability. Don't have to worry as much about the legacy media going after you and digging up skeletons in your closet. Can't afford to take more risk rather than just keep playing it safe. Thoughts? Any other things you would add? And yeah, personally, I personally think, as a third party, you might not be winning as many elections, but, you definitely still have a role to play, even if it's just, saying what's ever on your mind. If of course Reddit, they hate third parties since they think they take votes from their candidates. Just even if it's one that's like the Libertarian Party is more likely to take votes from Republicans than Democrats. But, ultimately, you just stand up for what you believe in, and even if Reddit doesn't care for it, you should still be able to do it. They censored me from the subreddit I get most of the posts from over 100 episodes ago now, but I'm still going to do this podcast, and even if they want me censored, I'm not going to do it. And that's my thoughts there. And then we're going to wrap it there. I'll see you guys next episode. Bye.